just because I'm older.
I'm not sure that's true.
Well, I'll tell you where I came from. And in the 1960s, one of the critical findings in research on fertility, which was unexpected and which people didn't understand, was the question of religion, not ethnicity or minority status at all. And up to that point, most of the demographers and social scientists thought, well, religion was going to go away, number one. And number two, the real determinant of fertility, variation in the United States in particular, was socioeconomic status. That was it. And it was sort of poverty, and people didn't have enough information about how many children they should have. And we're not going to eliminate poverty, but that's the key set of findings. And I had completed a dissertation trying to look at religion and fertility in a somewhat different way, and looking primarily at Jewish and Catholic Protestant fertility, and suggesting all among whites in the United States, and suggesting that there's something else that's going on, and it's probably not religion per se, and it has to do with some kind of community. And I think in the concluding chapter of that dissertation, I sort of suggested, well, maybe it has something to do with the particular position of Jews and Catholics within society. And I said, well, maybe it's something about there being an ethnic or minority group. And I came a few years later to Berkeley and taught a very exciting seminar for me on fertility. In the sociology department, Peter was there, and we had distinguished other people there as well, Ron Lee and Harriet Presser, I think, and June Sclair and Ruth Dixon, and remember they were Roger
Pretty
Avery.
good memory, yeah.
Fairly good group, and it was there. They were there to study in sociology and demography, and probably it was a new department of demography, but also extraordinarily good sociology department towards the end of the 1960s, and Peter was there and wrote a paper looking at blacks, and discovered, if I'm not mistaken, both for blacks and for Chinese, or no, I think it was Japanese Americans, two findings that at least among the blacks it was clear had higher fertility, but the sort of argument that we were talking about then was an argument about what happens not among the poor blacks or the lower classes where social class was really operating, but what happens at the upper level. We discovered this wonderful finding, which he sort of massaged and looked at more in detail, which is that educated blacks and educated Japanese Americans had lower, not higher fertility than we would expect. So something was operating that wasn't social class, and it was clear that it wasn't religion and religiosity, so it's sort of a confirming piece of evidence that we're really not talking about religion in its theological and its particularistic notion, and that it must have had something to do with the nature of this group, which was either a racial group or an ethnic group or a minority group. And so we said, well, maybe it has something to do with that. So when we began to sort of put it together and say, well, we have religious groups, Jews and Japanese Americans and blacks, all of them really not, what's common about them is not their religion and it's not their race. So it's got to be something that's not an ascribed characteristic or something that has to do with theology. So it must have something to do with their place in society, and we call that minority group status. Mm-hmm. But I think the paper had its effect on the profession, if I guess, and I think I've written many papers and books, as Peter, and I couldn't ever predict which paper ever gets cited more than others, but this has been extensively used. I think if I asked why, it wasn't because of any specific finding in the paper, but that it raised the question for a set of findings which said demographers in social science attribute consequences to characteristics, to, you know, the sort of simplistic way. A group has a different fertility pattern or a different migration pattern because they have different educational levels or different jobs or different marriage patterns and so on. And that just doesn't say very much. I mean, that's sort of a rather limited argument, and the more interesting or the more social science question becomes, what is about this combination that leads to community or group? And I don't think, I can't speak for Peter, but I think we said there's some effect out there. I don't know what it is, but it's not going to be characteristics. We said it must be something about being a minority group, and we I will let the phone ring, I think. I think what we were trying to say was that we weren't sure about what was it about this minority group, and I think in the article said, well, maybe it has to do with the insecurities of minority group status or something like that. I'm not sure I would argue that now. In fact, I'm sure I would not argue that it's only a social psychological dimension, and it has to do with some community effects. There are certain contexts within which minority groups, some of which happens to do with discrimination, or some of it has to do with the place of the group, ethnic or racial or religious group within the society, and what community means, what its institutions are, what its structural features are.
So in the article, as it appeared in '69, there was a strong emphasis on this idea about status anxiety and insecurity. Had you been thinking that way in the earlier part, in like the last chapter of your dissertation, and was it also present in the paper that you did? Or?
Yeah, I had, in thinking about this, read some of the literature on, I can't even remember exactly the word, but marginalization, essentially, of blacks as they would begin to move up in social class, and the psychological tension then of being a member of the minority community, but having a status that isn't consistent with that.
So status inconsistency and that producing status anxiety.
Right, some kind of anxiety in response of how, what's required for upward mobility, added effort if you are a member of a minority.
And do you see this as requiring a conscious feeling of group identity or group solidarity in the minority? Does it have to be a self-consciously aware minority in order for this effect to operate, or can it operate among a fairly anomic and unself-aware minority also?
No, I would think you would get far with a group that can't be identified in a fairly clear sense of forming a minority. But I wanted to add one thing to what Calvin said, and that is that, what I think gave this paper, created a lot of interest in the paper, was this effort to speak somewhat theoretically, in contrast to a lot of demographic work, which looks at the variables and what follows out. And this was an effort to relate it to something, the larger social structure, and give some interpretation.
Now, are you primary?
Go ahead. No, I would just, and I agree. I agree with Peter. I also think that the notion of comparison was something that people would compare blacks and whites. I think in the '60s it was whites and non-whites, people would look at Japanese Americans and the total American population. And what we were trying to do is to say, if there are really communities out there, and if we're going to look at some kind of what happens when people are on the margins between communities, which is what highly educated blacks in the 1960s were really, they were certainly not part of the larger black community, and they were, then the question becomes, how do people on the margins of these communities, and there's where that marginality comes in, and the intensity of saying, I really have to work that much harder just to break even. I got to run that much faster in these kinds of conditions. And what we did is we saw commonality among very disparate groups, which demographers and social scientists in the past had not really looked at. And I think that was also a sense in which this may be more generalizable as a process, which isn't either ascriptive, you're not born with it, you don't have low fertility because you're upwardly mobile or not upwardly mobile. It has something to do with the nature of groupness, and that's the theoretical. That's the point.
Okay. When you say that people are running faster to achieve the same result, then we're implicitly saying that if they reduce fertility in response to that, that it's because children are kind of a liability or an expense or baggage or something. Would this, because obviously wouldn't you say that if they're reducing fertility, they must be trying to economize, or would you put a primarily economic motivation on it, or what? Why are they reducing
We invest
fertility?
a lot of things in children.
Right.
I mean, the point of, if we have, one of the things that demographers teach, and one of the things I think that Peter has made a major effort in his career to look at, is this kind of generational cohort business. I mean, there are really generational issues involved here. And people invest in children not only money, but they invest love and care. They invest from one generation to another. And if concerns about social mobility are not only do you make it, but do your children make it, then if you really have to run hard to break even, what you're saying is, I have to invest in my children to provide them with the kind of resources that will allow them to accomplish what either I can or to move ahead. And I think one of the things that we see in the 1990s and not in the 1960s is that you really have to invest a lot more in kids because the market has changed out there, the structure has changed in a sense in which kids really have to work hard just to get up to where the parents are because of the marketing, the labor problem. But it's not an economic issue. It's really what I think is the heart of demography, which is generational cohort changes, context which changes, and groups fitting into that context, and parents investing all kinds of things in kids. You know, whether you invest in a kid's education is not for the only. I mean, people who think you invest in kids' education for economic returns are going to be very disappointed. You invest because investing in children's education means a certain lifestyle. It means a certain way of living. It means a certain kinds of love and care for the things that you value as a parent and what you think is important.
That would also explain Sheila Johansson's findings that the European elites historically have rarely replaced themselves. That similar kind of concerns about the investment requirements. But can you envision a situation in which children are such economic assets, such economically profitable products, if I could put it so crassly, that the minority group might compensate by having more rather than less children among them?
I mean, I think there are all kinds of groups, not only minority groups. I think there are all kinds of groups who make decisions and say more is better. More enhances the quality of my life. More is better because I have more people out there who can support me in old age. I mean, I think a good part of the world lives in that kind of system. I think it's the exception, both in history, where we say, well, we have fewer because I can invest in quality and get so they can live better. In most cases, I think, and certainly in farm communities, having somewhat larger family than you need to have for replacement is advantageous. If not, then people wouldn't have more children. I think that's.
I think you're talking about strategies here, and you don't want to get overly tied into the narrow economic interpretation that we might find prevalent in contemporary society. But there are strategies for maximizing what you value. There's certainly some religious groups that would have been lots of children, not for economic gain so much as for fulfilling the religious kind of orientation. this is good.
And I think contemporary evidence suggests, for example, that there are very little differences in the sort of standard categories that we use of Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. I mean, all of that has really been neutralized. And I think the latest materials for religious groups that I've looked at suggest to me, for example, that as a group, not subgroups, but as a group as a whole, Mormons are clearly distinctive in having, on average, a larger family size. And then you say, well, are they, quote, more religious than other groups? And I think that's not the direction in which I would think about it. They may or may not be. Their imperatives, religious imperatives, with regard to childbearing is probably no different. But there's a whole complex of factors associated with Mormonism, no less the value on the family. Now, whether it's derived from religious systems or derived from other kinds of systems, the important thing is they value that. And hence, they're willing to make those kinds of investments relative to other kinds of investments. That's, I think, what Peter was saying, is that there is a hierarchy here of values, and you have different groups within the population who make these kinds of choices, and they're not farmers, and it doesn't matter how educated Mormons are. It doesn't matter, for example, how economically well off they are. And it's true for selected small proportion of Jewish populations who are committed to certain kinds of religious values. It's certainly true of certain kinds of Protestant groups who are committed to certain kinds of religious and family values. It's true for Catholic groups, not because the Pope says this or that. I mean, that's what we really moved away from in this, and I think in our thinking generally in demography, is that there are group processes that are at work. You can learn them. Some are economic, but they're certainly not all economic. There are values out there. We often infer values from these contexts, and I think what we try to do then, and some of our subsequent work individually, has really been an attempt to say, how do we get at these kinds of things on a generational basis? How do we measure them directly? What are the structural contexts within which these things operate?
If I was looking at it, again, I think I would agree that less than the social psychological dimension. The thing that I would really focus on would be the sense of community. And that can be fostered by a religious orientation, such as Mormons, I think, or some Jewish communities. But that can be a tremendously positive thing in terms of having children if you're part of a larger community that shares some of the responsibility of caring for those children and reinforcing, you're not crazy to have a third or fourth child.
That's right.
We're all doing it.
That's right.
So now we're talking more about higher fertility than the compensatory sort of things that were featured in the article.
Yeah, and the other direction would be losing that kind of community. You're out there by yourself, trying to get ahead and get your children ahead, but without any kind of strong supportive network.
So if upward mobility affects the sense of community.
It sometimes does.
Yeah.
And I think we often erred when we thought upward mobility is the process that's leading to this, and then we would say, well, what is it about upward mobility? But I think upward mobility, if it results in different kinds of community, has different effects. I mean, we find that among Hispanic Americans, for example, on other dimensions. Sometimes I've just done an analysis with Fran on leaving home, also process of leaving home. One of the striking findings is that Hispanics, no matter how wealthy they are and how much they are socially mobile, they have different sets of values about the relationship between children and parents. I mean, they're just really distinctive.
And that's sustained within a community?
That's sustained within a community, that's right. And it's reinforced when you look at Hispanics who are in intensive Hispanic communities.
And if they leave,
right,
and are
but it's true also, and here again is the comparative, say, ethnic or group differences. The same process occurs for Protestants who are Protestant fundamentalists or part of communities that are reinforcing family values. It's not derived only from Protestant fundamentalism as a religious set of groups, but from the community which that implies. It's true for some other groups, Mormons, for example, who reinforce family connections. And this is not fertility, but relationships between parents and children when children leave home. Do they leave home in the context of setting up a family? Do they leave home towards independence? That's the new sort of break in this, but it seems to me the same process is really working. We don't have good measures of community, and we're getting them because as we get access to details of data, details of material, we really focus in, not as ethnographers, but as social scientists, to look at people in communities and people outside. And I think, I can't remember whether we included it in the paper or not. I haven't read the paper recently. It's been a few years. Nevertheless, it seems to me that one of the things that I think Peter did either in the paper, and we may have included it or argued, that Japanese Americans in Japanese American communities had sort of exaggerated this pattern. That is, there was we did it, I think, by, I'm not sure now, but if you look at Japanese Americans in California, I think it was at the time where there was a regional break that we looked at, and reinforced that. And I think that that's that was a crude attempt. We can do that much better with more detailed access to census and related data. And I think that's really an indirect attempt to get a community where Italians in Rhode Island, where there's a very large Italian community and a dominant Italian political sets of institutions, behave very differently than Italians in North Dakota who assimilate very rapidly. Mm-hmm. So to talk about Italian, third-generation Italians or fourth-generation Italian Americans in the United States misses the point. It neutralizes all the variants because you're not looking at the nature of Italian communities, which include institutions and locations and restaurants and churches and the power of family networks. And in North Dakota, just don't have enough of them, and they're just isolated. Those are the individuals that Peter was talking about.
Would you have, if you think back 25 years to when this appeared,
a quarter of a century.
Yeah, let's go. Other than the seminar format in which some of these ideas were exchanged between the two of you, were you talking to other people? What kind of exposure did this idea get to other people beyond the two of you while it was in germination, you might say, before it showed up in print?
I don't recall it. I remember some of those conversations.
Yes,
back and forth.
I don't know. The question's an intriguing one. I can't tell you. I can recall and often recall with great fondness the kind of excitement that characterized the University of California at Berkeley campus in the 1960s, and it wasn't only the student revolution that was happening in Sproul Plaza. It was a kind of an intellectual ferment, and I remember, I think it was in that seminar, Ron Friedman was visiting Berkeley I think it was on sabbatical, and he came in to the seminar to discuss his research that he was writing up on Taiwan, which is the first book that he had written on Taiwan. And Peter and everyone in this seminar, who were really wonderful, a group of students with great motivation to do very well and very smart. And they've just read everything that Ron Friedman had written and came into the seminar really prepared. Peter has repressed it all, I think. But they came in, and it was this stunning seminar. I mean, he came in, and for 3 hours, Ron didn't prepare anything, but he had students prepare questions and ask. The kind of intellectual exchanges that were going on are really quite wonderful. And if you think about the other faculty members, I was a junior faculty member, but if you think about the other faculty members who were there, who were extraordinary, just a half-hour conversation with Nathan Kufitz, or a half-hour conversation with Kingsley Davis or Judith Blake or Sam Preston, or then there were a series of economists there. Harvey Leibenstein was there at the time, he died this past year, and Al Fischler and some other people. I mean, these were people who were in the center of research. People were coming through. There was a lot of conversations and exchanges about all kinds of issues. And I often say, that I learned more in half-hour conversations with people in sociology and demography at Berkeley that I learned in all the years that I was a graduate student. And these were exciting times. Ideas were in the air, and people were very responsive. So,
In that type of a setting, if anywhere, I would have expected that a thesis like this would have got batted around extensively with a lot of people before it showed
I
up.
don't think so.
Well, there may have been some exchange in
Right.
the seminar
Yeah,
context,
right.
so you're right there.
I don't remember, but maybe Peter does, when the article was published in 1969. I can't remember it being discussed by students or colleagues. I mean, this was expected. People, I don't know how many student and faculty members wrote papers together. I don't remember if there were many. There were probably few. But I think we talked about the ideas, and I think there was a kind of an intellectual ferment there. I think it got outlandish response on the part of people. I was telling Peter before, we wrote the article, and weren't quite sure about it. We had questions about it, and so on. We submitted it to one journal. It was a good journal. We thought that it merited publication.
You're not going to say
I won't
on
say
the tape.
social forces
All right.
on the tape. I'm trying to spare you, Peter. Said it's social forces. They turned it down. And my general inclination at the time was, if you get an article rejected, you send it to a kind of journal that wasn't as good. and
One step
maybe
down.
One step down. I said, the hell with it. I send it one step up and send it to the AJS. And they accepted it, I think, without much revision at all, if I remember correctly. And I don't know how many dozens of articles Peter and I, over the last quarter of a century, have read of people who have submitted articles to various journals, and there must be, I don't know, 20, 30 articles out there on minority group status revisited, minority group status a second time, whatever kind of language they use, or another view of. And those are really quite, and they brought I think the article in a variety of testing in a variety of ways, and sharpened it. I think there was a lot of attempt to sort of go beyond at least the empirical argument. I'm not sure that the theoretical argument has ever really been tested. There was one real test of the minority insecurity hypothesis, I think, that I remember somebody, I think, actually had survey data on
attitudes.
measures of attitudes and security, and it seemed to work, which was even surprising to me at the time. But,
Well, I learned a lot of things working with Calvin on this first paper that I had sent out, we'd sent out for publication. But one of the really important lessons, and one graduate students might want to pick up, is that to have a paper rejected, you shouldn't be devastated by that or be thin-skinned. There's a lot of variation who's going to review it and what they're looking for. And, I think that was an important lesson for me, that what you do, if you're pretty sure you've got a good paper, you get it out again someplace, and not necessarily a real weak journal if it's turned down once.
well, Art Stinchcomb, who was then teaching at Berkeley, used to keep a file drawer of rejected
Rejects.
papers, right? And his position on that was, you collect about 6, 7, or 8 of them, and then publish them together as a book. And he does that, I think, in constructing social theories, which was a collection of papers that were rejected. And that's been a very useful and helpful book, and so on. So I think Peter's right. I think one of the lessons to be learned from this is not only the value, from my point of view as a very young faculty member then, of working closely with students and learning from them. The value of the course, for me, has always been how much I learn, not how much the students learn. But also the notion that there are a lot of readers out there, and a lot of people who evaluate materials, and they're not always right. They're not always on target. And if you really think you have a paper, listen to the reviewers, but also push for it. Over the last long period of time, we have drawers full of and stories of previously rejected papers that do fairly well when they finally get published.
Well, I think that's heartening advice for a lot of people, and I think a lot of people can take that to heart. Thank you very much.